Hi there, Dr. Brad here. And I decided to drop this advanced little tidbit class that's part of the Gut Health 101 class. We're in the 5th day of the 7 days right now in the free 7-day Gut Health 101 class. But I wanted to share with everyone some of the sort of cutting edge things I learned and heard about and what some of the thoughts I had as a result of them at this recent conference that I went to, where I got to hear some amazing researchers talk about their research and their studies. So I am going to jump into that here in a second. But what I'd like to do is see if I can share this in a couple places in the meantime. Because I'm using Facebook's native live program, thinking that might help me do it, because I've had the best time doing that before. But let's see what happens. So I want to thank you for being here. And I'm going to see if I can get some of my thoughts out. It's been about a week. And so some of them are getting a little fuzzy. But the more I share, the more I think it makes a lot of good sense. So, yeah, this is going super slow as far as sharing goes. So this is not the method to do that with, apparently. All right. I just got to make sure I at least share this in my Gut Health 101 class, because I'm broadcasting from the Dr. Brad Ellisor page. Man, this is super slow. Okay. Hey, all righty. So, boom, post. Here we go. Holy moly. Okay. Here we are again. Okay. So, check it out. I want to share basically two main things that I want to drop on you and give you some food for thought, some considerations, and hopefully they will help shift some of our paradigm, because it sure helped me shift some of my paradigm further and farther. So let's see. Let's start with the physics side of it, because I think that that's so interesting. So one of the presenters that I watched speak 3 different times, he shared about several studies. And so I'm going to tell you about one of the studies he shared about, and this involved fish. And they had 2 different kinds of fish, so they kind of ruled out the possibility of that the fish, well, anyway, they changed, they used trout and they used these zebrafish, which are millions of years apart in terms of evolution. And here's the study. So they took 40 fish and they put them into 2 tanks, tank A, tank B, 20 fish in each tank. Then they took the fish from tank A to another room and they x-rayed them. And the reason they did this, and what happens when we x-ray any animal, any biological creature, there's a protective response that occurs where there's some cellular changes, certain proteins are activated, and this is a well-documented, well-understood, easy-to-measure process that happens every time. Every time we x-ray fish, for example, they have these physiological changes, and so that's what happens. So they x-rayed fish group A, they did not x-ray fish group B, then they took them and put them in the same tank together with a net in between. So they shared the same water and they were able to see each other and interact, but they were kept separated by this net in between. They did that for 2 hours, and then they took them and separated them out again. And then they looked at the fish in tank B who hadn't been x-rayed, and they found that those fish had the same changes that the fish had done from tank A who had been x-rayed. Now, they're, whatever, they're scientists, so they don't make specific assumptions based on that. Maybe there was a behavioral thing, maybe the fish have some secret language that we're not aware of, so they were able to communicate, like the fish in tank A were like, hey, there's some crazy experimenters out there x-raying people, so get yourself ready. We don't know, but what we do know is that the fish in tank B who had never actually been x-rayed had those changes. So, okay, so they set that experiment aside. 40 new fish, tank A, tank B, and they did the same thing. Well, no, they didn't do the same thing. So tank A, tank B, no x-rays, nobody's been x-rayed at all. They dumped them in a tank together with a net in between. They let them swim around and hang out for 2 hours. Then they separated them again, tank A, tank B, x-rayed the fish in tank A, measured the fish in tank B. The fish in tank B had the same changes as if they had been x-rayed. Even though after the tank A fish had been x-rayed in this experiment, they had never interacted with the tank B fish. But the reason is, or what the speculation is, or what this phenomena is considered, is what's called quantum entanglement. And so the theory that they had, which may or may not be the case, is that there was a nonlinear aspect to time. And so these fish, when they were hanging out together before the X-ray in linear time, were able to sort of predict the future, tell the fish in tank B to change their physiology so that when they get X-rayed. Now, there's other possibilities of what could happen in terms of physics, but the point is this quantum entanglement aspect of reality, right? And they talked about it in terms of how that affects our genetic expression. Apparently, there are these microtubules that hang out right around the strands of our DNA that have quantum interactions within the tubules. And these have been identified as science, or by science, as the home or the physical manifestation of our consciousness. So our consciousness is housed in these microtubules, and there's a quantum entanglement with our genetic material. And apparently that can get out of sync based on stresses. And then that shows up symptomatically in a number of ways, autism spectrum being one of them. So this was that talk, right? So quantum entanglement, spooky action at a distance is what Einstein called that. All right. And then I saw another presenter a couple times. I saw him twice. And there were a couple things that I thought were very fascinating that I wanted to share. And so he really stressed he was all about gut health and the microbiome. And what he really stressed was the most important factor in the health of our gut and the health of our microbiome is diversity. And he stressed that the estimations of how many bacteria and microbes live in our gut that we've always heard, several hundred to a few thousand, is grossly underestimated, and that we really more likely have like 30 or 40,000 bacteria in there, hundreds of thousands, over 100,000 fungus, tons of parasites, viral genetic load that we can't even measure. And so you may have heard the idea that we're outnumbered by bacterial cells 10 to 1, in our body, in our gut. But the truth is that when we look at informationally, which is how I've started looking at biology with understanding genomes and stuff, we're actually less than 1% human. So we have 20,000 genes in our genetics, in our DNA. And when you start looking at the numbers in terms of the quantity or the diversity of the bacteria, the diversity of the fungus, the diversity of the virus, and how much genetic information is in those diverse populations, it dwarfs our human genetic information. And we become less than 1% human. And it really, makes the truth be that we're only alive and in this physical form at the favor of our microbiome. What else was fascinating to me was that, we've certainly heard a lot about our microbiome in our gut. We hopefully have an understanding that there are bacteria that live on our skin and, our hair and all our outward organs. But what they're finding now that we know how to look for it, is there are microbiota everywhere. We have a microbiome in our brain. I just reposted an article about microbiome that's found in bladders when they've studied women's bladders about UTIs and so forth. It really starts to point at a sort of misunderstanding and a very misguided theory and philosophy when we start hitting everything with antibiotics, because the implications ripple outward as we understand there's a normal bacteria, a normal microbiome, and all these other structures. So he mentioned a couple studies, which I'm going to mention here. And one of those was with breast cancer. And so they studied the tissue from women who had breast cancer, and they found that there was a particular bacterial array, populations of bacteria within those cancerous tissue in breast cancers that was similar across all these different people who had breast cancer. And they thought, wow, we're really onto something here. Maybe this is a bacterial issue, and maybe if we can, identify what this is and help change that, we might be able to cure the cancer. So then they took tissue samples from the same women, but from their non-cancerous breast, And they found a different profile, a different microbiota in there, a different microbiome in that breast tissue. Now, just stopping there for a second, isn't it fascinating that they found a microbiome in the breast tissue? Did you know that that existed there? I never knew that, but it makes sense. Anyway, but as they're trying to figure out what this means and the implications for health and curing cancer and so forth, they actually found that the women who had more of the microbiome that they found with the cancerous tissue actually had the less aggressive cancers and had the better prognosis and the better outcomes. And the women who had less of that bacteria, less of that microbiome, it had a more aggressive cancers and a worse prognosis and worse outcome measures. Okay, so we're going to set that one there. And there was another study that he mentioned, and this was with Lyme disease. So you may or may not know the organism that's considered responsible for Lyme disease are called spirochetes. It's just a little microorganism. And so what they did is they took a number of people with confirmed cases of Lyme disease, and then they measured the spirochete population in their tissues. And what they found was remarkable. What they found was that the individuals with the greater concentration of spirochetes had the less symptomatic, the less intense, and the better responding Lyme disease. And the people with the less spirochetes had the worst symptoms and had the less, response to treatment and so forth. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that fascinating? Do you think it possibly turns on its head our understanding of microbial activity and disease? Could it possibly be that we don't understand all the microorganisms that are in our body tissues? I mean, you may or may not know that it's been hard to count and hard to study them, because until recently, the only way we could study the microbiome in our gut was by stool samples. But the vast, vast majority of those organisms that live in there are anaerobic, meaning as soon as they come out and hit air, they die. And so we couldn't study them very well because they're all dead. But recent technologies allowed gene sequencing or genetic testing. So we've been able to get a much better view into what's really going on. But we still don't know a lot. There's still a lot unknown about the microbiome. But wouldn't it be fascinating if down the road we discovered that all of these antigens, all of these things that we assume are causative factors in disease are actually our normal microbiome, our normal flora in our body systems, trying to help our system to balance from an insult or an attack or a stressor. It reminds me of the cholesterol story and how research science got cholesterol so drastically wrong. And it sort of made sense at the time, though, because when people started dying from heart attacks in great numbers, which has only been recently in the last several decades, scientists or researchers started to try to figure out, like, what the heck's going on here? And so they didn't understand heart attack that well. They started dissecting people who died from heart attacks, and they found the coronary arteries were clogged by this waxy substance, which was cholesterol. And so they made the assumption, they drew the conclusion that the cholesterol was the problem. And that sparked a whole class of drugs that were to reduce cholesterol. It sparked a whole series of what we now know are horrible dietary recommendations on low fat and low cholesterol and high carb diets. But what we know is that, one thing we know is that the rate of heart attacks has not gone down with those changes. And what we also know, now that we understand how it works and we stepped back and looked at it from a more holistic, a more vitalistic perspective, where we understand that the body is a self-healing, self-organizing entity. And now, to add to that, it's a collection of self-healing, self-organizing entities, really. But that it's not like it just malfunctions and dumps a bunch of cholesterol and then suddenly gets clogged in one of the biggest arteries in our body. What really actually we discovered about cholesterol is that about heart disease is the cholesterol that we find clogging these arteries when people have heart attacks is actually being put there on purpose because of the continued and chronic insult on the arterial walls. And the cholesterol is what the body's trying to use to help correct that problem. And because the same sick destructive lifestyle habits haven't been changed, so much damage occurs that the immune function and the reparative function of the cholesterol can't keep up. And then we have heart attack. And then when we open the person up, we find this cholesterol in there. Wouldn't it be fascinating, or wouldn't it make sense from that same mindset that if you're one of the early researchers about, viruses and bacteria, and people were starting to get like the flu, and you drew their blood and you found antibodies to flu viruses, and you found flu viruses in there. And you thought, well, people who don't have the flu don't have flu viruses floating around in their blood in any great number. And people that do have these flu symptoms have the flu virus floating around. So the flu virus must be the cause. But what if that flu virus floating around our blood was just like the cholesterol in those arteries? What if those flu virus were part of our normal, healthy, diverse microbiome? And the reason they were in such number was because something else was out of balance. Something was out of alignment and out of balance in our system. And those viruses were actually part of our ecology, our ecosystem, our vast, vast, diverse ecosystem, trying to self-regulate, self-heal, and self-balance. If you were an early researcher and you didn't know about white blood cells or any of these kind of things yet, and you took blood samples from somebody who was displaying symptoms of being sick, and you saw a whole bunch of white blood cells in there, you might make the conclusion that the white blood cells are the problem. And if it was this modern day pharmacology, you might actually make a whole set of drugs to reduce the amount of white blood cells in our body, because you might think that the white blood cells are the problem. What if that's what's going on with the so-called antigens? What if that is what's going on with the bacteria and the viruses and the fungus? What if it's actually our diverse ecosystem doing its job to the best of its ability to help correct and bring things back into balance? And the only reason that gets spirals out of control is because we live in such an out of balance way with our nature. And we have such a poor diversity of microbiome because of the dead food that we eat and the chronic exposure to massive toxins that we give our kids and we give ourselves, and the lack of time spent outdoors exposed to nature as we should be. Fascinating considerations. But really, if you give it some thought, at least if I give it some thought and I apply my rational brain to the story, it makes a lot of good sense. Because haven't you ever noticed that our body is a self-regulating organism? And have you ever noticed that we have an immense innate intelligence within us, and that is always looking to balance and regulate the system? Here's another thing they've discovered. If you think about the huge complex eco network in our gut, for example, 40,000 species of bacteria, 100,000 species of fungus, countless species of viruses, thousands of species of parasites. They all play this amazing synergistic role when our body's functioning right. They help us digest our food. They help inform the nervous system. They help inform the immune system. They help to create certain nutrients and vitamins and minerals that help with mineral absorption. They help drastically in keeping their own populations in good balance. But you ever wonder how they do that? How is it that 40,000 species work in this concert? And not only 40,000 species of bacteria, but how do they work in concert with 100,000 species of fungus? And then how do they interact in this beautiful way with our own immune system cells and our enteric nervous system cells in order to keep health on this incredibly finely balanced system? And what happens when we lose that ability for them to work together? It's the implications are profound to consider, because what we know in cellular biology, whether it's bacteria or human cells, when we separate these cells and remove their ability to communicate with other either like organisms or similar organisms, what they do is they shrink and they go into a survival mode. This is exactly what happens in cancerous cells. they have some insult that they lose their ability to communicate with the cells around them, and they shrink, literally. And then they start to go into survival, which is constant replication. They have no ability to know what's going on in the rest of the organism, whether they should replicate, whether they should do their function, if they have a, like a neurotransmitter they create, or whatever their function is in the cell. They go out of control, and they start replicating, and they start looking out for their own survival. And this is exactly what cancer is. So I think that's as far as I want to go today. Consider the communication of these microbes and the cells of our body, and how there's this massive, massive, massive interspecies harmony and communication that occurs in our gut and in our body that we're only just barely beginning to understand. All right, thanks for jumping on. Thanks for joining. I appreciate you, and we'll see you later.